Alright, Daf Tzadi. Wednesday's Daf. We got to start Perek Gid Hanoshi yesterday. We were discussing what is the chiddush of the Mishnah of saying that there is an Isser Gid Hanosha by Mukdashim. The Gemara had settled on saying it was talking about the Shalil. And the point of the Mishnah is that it is a Machlekes Tanaim Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, whether or not we'll say an Ein Isser Chal Al Isser issue. Frek the Gemara now, 6 lines from the bottom of Pei Tesamud Beis, Umi Motzis Amrit, the Tervayu Bahadi Adodi Ka'asuk. Is it shaykh to say that there's both an Isser of Gid Hanosha and Kodshim that are Chal on this Uber at the same time? V'hatana, the Mishnah Masechta Nazir says, Al elu tumais an nazir megaleach. A nazir has to be megaleach, which means he has to be seisers naziris and cut his hair for serious tumah. What kind of tumah is that? Al hameis, tumas meis, al kazayis min hameis. The koshalon, and over there on that mission, the Gemara Mem Tesa Masechta Nazir asks, Al kazayis min hameis megaleach, al kulon lekol shekain. Why do I need to identify both a mace and a kazayis min hameis? It's a kal v'chaimer. Once you say a kazayis min hameis, certainly be a whole mace. V'yomer Rav Yochanan avdem. Rabbi Yochanan over there in Nazir said, Lo nitzrachel lenefel shlei nikshru evara begidin. When we're talking about the mace, we're not talking about a regular dead body. We're talking about an underdeveloped nefel. That it is still going to be matama as tumas mace, even though it doesn't have a kezayis of regular basar. Moving over to Tamid Aleph, Alma, what do you see from the Sugi in Masechta Nazir? That Isser Mukdashim Kadim. Because as Rashi explains, there's a progression. As soon as there is an Uber there at all, it will be Kadosh. But the Gidin have not yet been created. So the kasha that the Gemara is asking is, don't tell me that the Isurim of Gid Hanosha and Hegdish are at the same time, and therefore there won't be any problem with Isser Chal Isser. It's one at a time. First you have Hegdish, and then you have the Isser Gid. And Afal Gav, the Isser Mukdashim Kadim, and even if you can tell me the Hegdish comes before the Isser Gid Hanosha, also Isser Gid, Chayil Alayu. Still, the Isser of Gid Hanosha is going to be Chal on this. So the Gemara an interesting line, because Shekain Isurei Noyeg Bebnei Noyach. There's an extra Chumrah that exists by Gid Hanosha because of the fact that Isurei is Noyeg Bebnei Noyach, and therefore we'll say Afal Pikain, it will be Chal al Isser. Now, just to understand what the Gemara even means, what does it mean Shekain Isurei Noyeg Bebnei Noyach? Because it's not one of the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noyach, but it means the Bnei Noyach, literally, meaning the children of Noyach, before we had the Torah, Klal Yisrael, had a reality of being Bnei Noyach. And even though typically that would be a kula, because it wasn't nishnis and repeated by Maimon Har Sinai, and the Ramban even makes this point over here, but yet still, our Gemara is looking at the very existence of this Aveira, Kaidem Matan Torah, as a reason to say it's more machmir, and therefore it will be chal, even on the behemoth that already has an Isser of Hegdish on it. But in this Gemara of calling Klal Yisrael Bnei Noyach, Kaidem Matan Torah, the Ritva actually calls us Bnei Noyach in a halachic sense, that we had a din Bnei Noyach Kaidem Matan Torah. Of course, this is negated to the famous Prashas Drachim about what was Klal Yisrael's status Kaidem Matan Torah. That's how he understands the machlekes between Yosef HaTzadik and the Shiv Teikah. Al Kopanim, our Gemara is saying that creates a reason for Chumrah and a reason why you'll say that the Isser Gid Hanosha will be Chal on the Hegdishtika Uber. So now, Man Shamas Lei Haisvara. Who's the one who says this idea that the Gid Hanosha was negated to Bnei Noyach? It's Rabbi Yehuda. So it means we have to zetzayin our Mishnah like Rabbi Yehuda. But V'homas Nisan Deloika Rabbi Yehuda. Diktani Noyeg B'mehema Ubechaya Ubiyerach Shel Yemin Ubiyerach Shel Smile. Because of these other ideas that the Mishnah says, which is not going like Shitas Rabbi Yehuda, as our Gemara is going to tell us later. So you can't zetzayin our Mishnah like Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore we won't be able to say this idea of Shekeni Surah Noyeg B'bnei Noyach. And for the Gemara, Hai Tana Savar Lekavase B'chada Upola Galei B'chada. It's not actually Rabbi Yehuda. It's just borrowing that shita of Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore our Tana can hold like Rabbi Yehuda in this regard, but not in the other regard. But Frek the Gemara, Emer Deshamas Leila Rabbi Yehuda B'tmeya. The only time that there was the Isser Kaidem Matan Torah for the Bnei Noyach of the Isser Gid Hanosha is by non-kosher animals. The Isser Lav, because that was just a regular lav, and therefore the more chomer dika Gid Hanosha can be tacked on top of that lav. But Kodshim, de Isser Kares Mishamasle, who says that you can now add on the lav of Gid Hanosha, no matter how chomer it is, on top of the actual Isser Kares of the Kodshim? So Ella, we're going to have to say a different pshat, that the Isser Gid Hanosha is not going to be chal on the Kodshim, and therefore we're not talking about the Gid Hanosha of regular Kodshim animals. Ella, what's our Mishnah talking about when we say that it's negayah to Kodshim? It's a very specific and narrow case. Elohacha b'mevakeres askinan. We're dafka talking about an animal that gives birth to a bechar. That's when we will say there'll be an Isser Gid Hanosha. Why? D'berechem kadosh. Because as it emerges from the rechem, meaning at its leda, that's when it has kedushas bechar, and that's when there'll be an Isser Gid Hanosha. So because they're babas achas, therefore both Isurim will be chal. Or v'ibayasema, maybe the Gemara doesn't like this because it's such a narrow case, but another pshat in our Mishnah could be Vladois Kodshim behev yasan hein Kodshim. Our Mishnah could be talking about Vladois Kodshim that only became kadosh when they were born, Bnei not earlier as nuber, and therefore the Gid Hanasha Isser, which happens before, but the Kachim may only happen as it's born, and therefore it could be like an Isser Meisif, because you're adding on the Isser of the Kachim to this pre-existing Isser Gid Hanasha. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Yosef Lashanu Ella Kachim HaNe'echalim. This that the Mishnah says that the Gid Hanasha is Negeh to Kachim, that's only talking about the kinds of Kachim that you eat, which Rashi speaks out is the Chatas, the Oshim, the Shlomim. Aval Kachim she'ein Ne'echalim. But let's say like a carbon oil where it's kulei kolol and all burned up. Ein Isser Gid Naeg Bahen. There is no Isser Gid Hanasha. V'Rabbi Yochanan Omar Echad Kachim HaNe'echalin V'Echad Kachim she'ein Ne'echalin Isser Gid Naeg Bahen. Now, what are we talking about? Omar of Papa V'le Pligi Kan Lahal Kaisai. What Rabbi Yochanan is saying is talking about whether you get malchus for eating the Gid Hanasha and Kan Lahal Loisai. But by Rav Chia bar Yosef, his Loishanu is talking Lahal Loisai, to actually burn it on the Mizbeach. So they're not arguing. They're talking about two different ideas, malchus and hakrava. Or ikadiamri, or another way to understand this, Omer of Papa V'le Pligi Kan L'chaltzai. By Rav Chia bar Yosef, it's talking about that there's no chiyuv to remove the Gid Hanasha before putting it on the Mizbeach, as long as it's still inside that part of the animal. But V'kan Lahal Loisai, where Rabbi Yochanan was talking about bringing the Gid Hanasha on the Mizbeach as an independent thing once it was removed from the thigh of the animal. But Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Omar Lahal Loisai Pligi, they taka do have a machlekes lagabe bringing it on the Mizbeach, even when the Gid Hanasha is actually inside and part of the animal. Did Tanya, because the Brisa says, V'hikter akayin asakala Mizbecha, when you bring the carbon oil, you bring everything on the Mizbeach. La rabbis, we darshan, hoatzamos, vagidim, vakarnayim, vatalafayim, all the parts of the animal are brought on the Mizbeach. Yachal afilu parshu. That would sound like even if they are separated from the animal, you still bring it on the Mizbeach. No, Talmud Leimer, v'asisa oilesecha habasar v'hadam, which sounds like it's only the meat and the dam that you put on the Mizbeach, and not these other bones and hooves, etc., part of the animal. Now, ibosar v'dam, yachal yachleit gidim atzomis. I should think I got to remove it. V'yala basar legami Mizbeach. No, you don't remove them. Talmud Leimer, v'hiktir akayin is hakol ha-Mizbecha. So, okay, it said, how do you reconcile l'chayra, what seems to be a steer minebe in the pasuk? Do you or do you not bring these ancillary parts of the animal on the Mizbeach? Michu baran yalu. If they're all connected, you bring them up. Parshu, once they separate from the animal, afilu b'roishai shel Mizbeach. Even if they're on top of the Mizbeach, you just don't bring it as a carbon, but you have to take it off the Mizbeach. Now, how do we see from this brisa that this is Shitas Rebbe and not of the Shitas Rabbanan? Uman tana deshamas le da'omer parshu yerdu. Who has that very chomer de kashita? That's going to be Rebbe. Did Tanya, because a different brisa says, Victor akayin asakayil. That's la rabbis atzamas vagidim akarnayim atalafayim. Afilu parshu, and even if they get separated from the actual animal, umani makayim asisa le'asecha basar v'adam. That's pepaikin. That's when they are exploding off the Mizbeach. So okay, it's sad. Ikule basar atam machzir. The pasuk's telling us that if it's partially burned and then it explodes off the Mizbeach, you put it back to finish the job of burning it. But v'yatam machzir ikule gidim v'atzames. If these ancillary parts of the animal were only partially burned and they fly off the Mizbeach, you don't put them back. But Rebbe Eimer, Kosev Echad Eimer, one pasuk says v'yektir akayin asakal, which is riba. But Kosev Echad Eimer, v'asisa elesecha basar v'adam, is a miyat. So haketzad l'chayr it's a stira. No, because mechubar and yalu parshu afilu b'reisha shel Mizbeach yerdu. So what do you see? That Rebbe is the Tana that holds that all these extra parts of the animal that separate from the body of the animal don't go on the Mizbeach. But according to Shitas Rabbanan, which is more mekel, they could be on the Mizbeach. So Rebbe and the Rabbanan have a machlekes how to understand the pasuk. So now the Gemara is going to go through Rabbanan who understand that the ribu is including the kranayim and tlafayim, etc. That mechubarin, if they're still attached to the animal, lo yitztrach kol rebuye. Why? Because mididahavi areisha shel oila, which the Torah says for sure you have to burn on the Mizbeach, even though there's lots of bones inside the head of the animal. But ki yitztrach kra, when does the Torah actually need to tell us that you should actually bring these kinds of extra parts of the animal on the Mizbeach? That's laparsha only when they become separated from the rest of the meat of the animal. For Rebbe, who understood from the pashtus of the pasuk that only the attached parts of the animal are going to be brought on the Mizbeach, he'll say mechubarin to head Torah. If they're still attached, they'll be daimed to the head of the animal, turning over to him and beis lo yitztrach kra rebuye. I wouldn't need to have a chiddush. I can understand from the head of the carbon oil that it's mutter to have in the Mizbeach that these other parts are also mutter. But Yisrach Kra, where is there a chiddush in the Torah to need the heter? That's la Gid Hanasha b'mechuber. It's to be mutter the Gid Hanasha when it's still inside the thigh of the animal. That's going to be where the Torah is talking about. For Rabbanan, and why didn't they feel you needed to have that heter? Because mimashke Yisrael, min hamutter li Yisrael. The Torah tells us, we've had this before a couple of times, that you can only bring on the Mizbeach that which is mutter for a yid. It has to be mimashke Yisrael. So the Gid Hanasha, which is usher normally to eat, so you can't bring it on the Mizbeach, even if it's part of the actual basar. So therefore the Torah is adding these extra atzamas and gidin to that there's a ribui for those atzamas and gidin that are separated from the carbon oila. V'Rebbe, what would he say? Even though the Gid Hanasha is brought on the Mizbeach, midid havi achelav and dam, just like chelav and dam, which is certainly normally usher to eat, but there's no problem on mashke Yisrael because it's brought on the Mizbeach. I heard a kasha that how are you ever allowed to bring karbonos on Yom Kippur? L'chair, it's not mashke Yisrael. You're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. But you could say a pretty straightforward chilik that there's no real isser on the food at all on Yom Kippur. It's all an isser on the person that he's not allowed to eat. But the food itself has no chesron of being mashke Yisrael. All right, but to argue back with Rebbe about me to have a chelav and dam, zok the Gemara v'Rabbanan mitzvah mekach shayni. By chelav and dam, that is the mitzvah to bring the carbon. And Rashi has a very strong lashon here. Chela v'dam hu ikar hakarbon. So you can't say that that's going to be a raya that you can therefore also bring gid hanasha, which is certainly not the ikar carbon. Okay, but what's the whole point of this brisa? We see that there's a machlekes tanaim whether or not a gid hanasha that's still inside the animal can be brought as a carbon oila. And that's exactly what Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak had said is the machlekes tanaim. Amar Rav Huna, gid hanasha shel oila choltzoi letapuach. You take it out of the thigh and you throw it on top of the tapuach, which is that mound of ashes in the middle of the mizbeach. Amar Rav Chizda, Mari Dechi, which sounds like he's very surprised. Miksiv al kain lo yoichel mizbeach. Does it say that the mizbeach is not going to have the gid hanasha? Al kain lo yoichlu b'nei Yisrael ksiv. So why wouldn't it be on the mizbeach? Of course you can burn it on the mizbeach. V'Rav Huna, who asers the gid hanasha on the mizbeach, mimashke Yisrael min hamutr li Yisrael, and since the gid hanasha is not mimashke Yisrael, it's not going to be on the mizbeach. Meisvei, they asked on Rav Huna from the brisa, gid hanasha shel shlomim mechabdoi la'ama. You take it out of the thigh of the animal and you put it into the ama, which is that canal that runs across the floor of the Chatzar HaMikdash. That's where all the dam collected. But by putting the gid hanasha into it, it would be swept out. Vishal oila and the gid hanasha of an oila, as opposed to the shlomim, is ma'aleu, is brought on the mizbeach. So my lav ma'aleu umaktira. It sounds like you burn it on the mizbeach. So you have a kasha and Rav Huna, and for the Gemara loy ma'aleu v'choltzai, just bring it up on top of the mizbeach while it's still inside the thigh of the animal, and then you remove it, and then you throw it into the tapuach, as Rav Huna had said. Lamaisa, once you took it out of the thigh and you don't burn it, why are you even putting it on the tapuach, which is on the mizbeach? Just get rid of it before you bring it on the mizbeach. And for the Gemara, because mishum shenemar, because the Torah says akriveu no lefchasecha. It's the pasuk in the first parak Malachi which says you shouldn't bring shvacha things on the mizbeach. So it's not proper to have a pre-dissected animal brought on the mizbeach, and therefore you don't take out the gid hanasha before you bring it up. Tani kavasi de Rav Huna, that gid hanasha shel shlomim is mechabdei la'ama, v'shel oila is chetzel l'tapuach. Tanan Hasam, we learned in the Mishnah Masechta Tamid that tapuach haya be'emtza mizbeach, this ash mound, this pile of ashes was in the middle of the mizbeach, and it was round like an apple, that's why it's called the tapuach. Pa'amim haya olav k'sholish me'as kur. There was sometimes that there was so much ash. How much ash was there? There was 300 of kur of ash on it, which if you do the math, which I certainly did not, it would equal 675 cubic ames. Amar Rava guzma. Chazal are exaggerating when they're saying that number, because as the Mishnah in the third parak Midai says, the whole surface area of the top of the mizbeach is only 24 amas by 24 amas. Another example where we have a guzma is hishku es hatamid b'kaishel zav. They gave the animal of the carbon tamid what to drink from a golden cup. Amar Rava, also guzma. They used a kavadika cup, but not necessarily a gold one. Amar Rabbi Ami, dibra Torah lashon havoi. There are times when the Torah speaks actually in exaggerated terms, hyperbole. Dibra neviim lashon havoi and dibra chachamim lashon havoi. And now let's give examples of each. Dibra chachamim lashon havoi hada amrin, that the tapuach reached the size of 300 kur. Dibra Torah lashon havoi, because arm gedayel is b'tzuras shamayim, that the description of the Meraglim, the Torah when it reports it is saying it clearly larger than it really was. And Dibra neviim lashon havoi vatiboka haaretz b'kailam, that the pasuk in Malachim talks about the coronation ceremony of Shlomo HaMelech, that it was so loud it sounded like an earthquake. It's an exaggeration to make a point. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani, Amar Shmuel, b'shleishim mekaymes dibru chachamim lashon havoi ve'eluhein tapuach, as we said, gefen upareiches. Tapuach ad amrin. Gefen ditnan, the Mishnah in third parak Midais says, gefen shel zav hayayimed des al pischei shel heichel. There was a grapevine made of gold by the doorway of the heichel. Umudla al gabe klunsais. It was suspended on poles. V'chol misha hayamisnadev gargir oyeshkel. Anybody who donated one of the golden grapes or clusters, maybe v'telaba, would bring in and the kohen would hang it up. Amar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzaddik, Maisa hayav nimnu aleha shalish me'as kahanim lefnaisa. They had so much gold on the grape that it took 300 kahanim to clear all the donated gold, which is clearly an exaggeration. Pareiches the time. What's the guzma that we're talking about by the pareiches? Because the Mishnah in the 8th parak of Shkolim says Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Aimer Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Azgan, that pareiches uvya tefach, the thickness of the pareiches was a tefach. V'al shivim ushnayim nirim ne'egeres, and it was woven on 72 nirim, on these different devices that would raise and lower the warp threads on the loom. V'al kol nima v'nima esrim v'arba chutin, and each thread had 24 strands in it. Arka arboim ba'ama, it was 40 amas long. V'rachba esrim ba'ama, and its width was 20 amas. Umishmayim v'shtei riboy nasis, and it was made from 820,000 threads. Ushtayim oisa b'shana, and there were 2 made every year. Ushalosh meyes kahanim etablanasai, and took 300 kahanim in order to put it into the mikveh if it ever became tameh. And Rashi says this is where the guzma was, because you didn't need that many kahanim to take care of that job. And we're going to stop here and pick it up with the 2 dots tomorrow.